Hello, this is Jodie Brunning from Physicians and Scientists for Global Responsibility. And today I'm talking with Professor of Public Health, Grant Schofield from Auckland University of Technology. Hi, Grant. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Let's talk about health span, I suppose, living a good life.
It's really important, and you started off your PhD. Really did you downplayed this, but your PhD interests me because it was in mathematical modeling, and it started off your journey as someone who is looking at questions, who is asking questions and doing a lot of analysis. So that's put you in a wonderful position to be able to talk about exactly what you want to talk about. And so your professional shift has been moving to looking at nutrition, as well as exercise and therapy. So how did this sort of coalesce for you?
Yeah, I was a psychologist in a school of psychology in Australia. Was my first academic appointment, and I came to understand that psychology is interesting, and it still is to me, how people change their behaviour. But my role personally in all this is that I'm reasonably energetic and I want to solve problems, and I don't particularly want to listen enough for the other person to talk them into it in the techniques of psychological counselling. So I'm a much better researcher and scientist and advocate than I perhaps am in any clinical setting I'd provide any use. So that's that. And I've always been interested in how being active affected both your mood in the first place, so your overall disposition and then your overall quality of life. And I suppose by the end of the 1990s, the US Surgeon General had put out their first warning, the same way about tobacco, that moving was such a crucial part of living a long, healthy life. Then and we started to understand for the first time, and it is worth remembering that it's only 25 years ago that we started to just go, my gosh, there's a profound difference in generations and both their body size, and then eventually things like diabetes and then mental health in these generations. And you'd go and look at people. If I go and look at I think I've got a photo at home, a 1974 picture of me in what was then called Standard 1 in Twizel Primary School in the South Island of New Zealand. And you might compare that with a modern first year primary school class, and it's just a profound difference in the shape of both the teachers and the children. And by our standards, they look like they're underfed, but of course they were down at normal weight. So this had all changed. And then, at least where I was in Australia, the money was really pouring towards physical activity health promotion rather than nutrition health promotion. And I love that area a lot. And we started with this 10,000 steps idea and pedometers, and even I think the interesting therapeutic interventions with exercise. And in fact, you might be interested, the first ever piece of research I supervised with a thesis student in Queensland in the mid-90s was a young woman had a son who was in first year of primary school and had been diagnosed with ADHD. And as was common in the time, and actually still is common, he was given medicines, dexamphetamine type medicines, Ritalin, to focus his attention. And what she did, and you probably wouldn't get ethical approval for this in today's world, is that she said, well, what we're going to do is take the 5 boys in that classroom and we're going to take them off their medicines, and instead we'll send them out in pairs every 40 minutes or so with these pool noodles, big things, and they whacked each other on the trampoline for 5 or 10 minutes and came back inside, and it had a profound improvement on their behavior and didn't have all of the other negative side effects of the stimulant medicine. So we've been thinking about activity as both in the psychological realm and then in the physical realm for ages. And then something happened, I suppose, in the end. I'd been back in New Zealand here at AUT for a while, and we'd been pretty successful at getting, you know, a lot of grants around getting people active, which is fine. And I think 3 or 4 things happened all at the same time for me, which I thought were really important. One was that I work in a place that also does quite a lot of exercise science, and you can do the athlete stuff where you're looking at VO2 max and all these types of fitness measurements, which, you know, are all interesting. But when you've got people doing this, you can also look at the energy partitioning. So how much fat are you burning for fuel, both when you're resting and exercising at various intensities, and how much carbohydrate are you burning? And what was interesting is there was such big differences in this. Some people were very, what we call, metabolically flexible, and so they would burn almost exclusively fat when they're resting, like you and I are now. And even at low exercise intensities, walking and then jogging and even moderate speeds of running, almost all of their energy is coming from fat. And in the end, when you get them fully, you know, running flat out, then they still burn fat, but they're getting extra energy from burning carbohydrate. Whereas other people didn't burn fat at any stage, resting, walking, jogging, anything. They're just sugar burners. And actually, there's profound differences in those people. So first of all, if you're a type 2 diabetic, you're almost certain to be in the second category. And if you shifted people's diet, that's how you change this. You reduce their carbohydrate intake substantially, tip the whole food pyramid on upside down, then you could move these people to be really good fat burners, which ran completely counter to anything I'd heard of. You know, I'd been through the carb thing as an athlete myself. And I'd also had this PhD student, Katja from Siefken from Germany, and she'd had these, as the Germans tend to do, you know, her 5th internship with the WHO all around the world, and she'd been in Suva. And she managed to sort of get her PhD to be, you know, doing research in the remote South Pacific Islands doing diabetes prevention. And so her and I got these paid for trips to all these crazy islands. It was ridiculous. But you'd go to some of these ones, especially in Vanuatu, that really were still living on subsistence type situations. They were completely healthy, right? So they were, you know, no cancer, no cardiovascular disease, no stroke, no poor mental health. You know, if you got through childhood, which is still a battle, then you're going to live to your mid-70s and this sort of idiopathic death, right? You're extensively healthy, living in society, working in part of the village, and health goes downhill to work and you die, which surely we're aspiring to.
And they're not, you use the word subsistence, but we could also use the term sort of ancestral diets. They're eating what they're
yeah, 100% fish, mainly fish actually, and then coconut products, and you know,
and the oil and the fat in coconut.
Yeah, and you're sent there with these ridiculous guidelines, the World Health Organization's guidelines about healthy eating, to make sure they don't get diabetes. So it's just ludicrous, you know. Like I walk around going, eat more grains or something. What is this?
So this is a really challenging thing, because our guidelines are very clear that we need perhaps 4 servings of cereals or grains a day.
Yeah. Well, then you can go to the Pacific Islands where they do that. And the most interesting one to me is an island called Tarawa, which is part of a chain of islands called Kiribati. And I mean, it's just a disaster. They are eating, you know, mainly carbs and some grains. And, you know, diabetes there, at least in my estimation, would be the highest in the known world at about 70% of adults.
Goodness.
You know, it's an astonishing thing. And again, you know, you're saying, oh, just eat less fat, that's a problem. And it's such a contrast between these Pacific Islands that just magnifies the ridiculousness of the guidelines. So that happened, yeah.
Yeah. And so about when was that? What year roughly was that?
Probably 2012 or
Right.
so.
Yeah.
And also we'd been doing all this work on, I'm actually at one now that I'm sitting as these, you know, height adjustable and standing desks and stuff. You know, if we could just get people doing more non-exercise activity, then that might make a big difference to their health. And actually, they're good fun and everything, but it doesn't make that much difference. It might help with your posture or your low back pain or something. And by far, the most interesting thing is that between individuals in the same environment, you know, even if it's just a mainly seated office environment, there's huge differences in fidgeting and non-exercise activity and just getting up and down from your desk. So the leanest people in offices will get up 50 times more a day. They might accumulate up to another 5Ks of moving around the office. And the question is that voluntary? And the answer is no. And then the question is, why are they different? And I actually think, to a large part, there's the hormonal signaling, especially of insulin and leptin, and the metabolic factors that are actually mainly dietary related. They interact with phenotype for sure, that dictate that. And if you were to do some fasting or do a ketogenic diet, or really restrict the amount of processed refined carbohydrate you have, then you start to unlock some of those behaviors, which I think are normal for humans. And so those really, I think those few things were convincing me to do things in that space. And there was a bit of a movement around the world as well, going, actually, you know what, these dietary guidelines are wrong. And we need to move on them. And I, in my naive stupidity, because the fields of physical activity and exercise, fitness, health promotion, and the fields of diet and nutrition are so similar in many ways. You're dealing with human behavior. These are essentially healthy behaviors and that sort of thing. But the academic and practicing community and the physical activity and fitness one is one of reasonable congeniality. Like, people get on and talk to each other. And in nutrition, it's the opposite to that. I thought, oh, well, this is obvious. We know the science about this now, that it'll be just a matter of time before we change the guidelines. And it's actually, once you roll in big food and big pharma and the politics, and then I suppose religion as well plays a factor in, plant-based versus other things. It's the exact opposite of that. It's, really a very negative dog-eat-dog type world in the academics of nutrition. And it's been a real eye-opener actually over the last 10, 15 years for me.
Yeah, I tend to see it more as a there are, there's political and financial interests. It's like with any technology, they're selling a product. If you're producing the scientific or technical information that contradicts the sales of that product, you put yourself at risk, or you put your reputation at risk. Whereas people doing exercise, there's different funding models there, but they're not quite as, there's not quite the big global sort of massive industries behind that.
Yeah, and if there is an industry, it's the fitness industry, which supports people being more active. So I suppose that's a different, it's working with everyone. Yeah.
Exactly. And so then in 2017, you became, this is quite cool, you became the Chief Education, Health and Nutrition Advisor for the Ministry of Education. So this may have been part of your realizing how political this world was?
Oh, well, that whole job's a disaster. The backstory on that is, we'd published, Karen Zinn and I had published these What the Fat books, and the main one, What the Fat, had done really well and sold hundreds of thousands of copies, which was cool. And that had provoked quite a response from local academia in medicine, such that there was this letter written to the Vice Chancellor of my university, undersigned by various academics from other universities, professors and medical schools and stuff, and also the National Heart Foundation, Diabetes New Zealand, the Cancer Society, saying that we were not just out of line, but in fact our advice was so unethical we were killing people.
That's
so that had been going on, which was really interesting to us, and because we thought we were having the exact opposite metabolic effect than that, and in fact they were the people guilty of that. And so that got quite a lot of notoriety, and it had influenced a lot of people, including at that time one government minister. And she had said, "Yeah, would you like to do this job?" I was like, "Oh, okay. I want to stay at the university. I'll do it half time, and I'll go back and forth to Wellington." And when the other medical and nutrition establishment who'd I'd been appointed to this, it was all hell really broke loose. And in fact, I saw some of the letters that were written to ministers then about me saying, don't do this. But they were right, I shouldn't never have been appointed, because it's a hopeless job for someone who wants to be outspoken about public policy, because it turns out that as a public servant, your job is not to question the public policy, but to help enact their policy, which was ridiculous. And the minister, who was very supportive, actually partially talked her into leaving politics because it was bad for her health. And so the only person who supported me had left before I even started. And I just...
You don't help yourself, Grant. You don't.
No, the most miserable 2 years of my life, frankly.
And it's really interesting, because if people search on the internet, they'll find the press release with you becoming the Chief Education, Health and Nutrition Advisor. And do you remember how simple the 5 points you were making? That was probably at the heart of your message.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what I said about those 5 points, but hopefully they were coherent.
Yeah, no, they were. It was eat real whole food.
Yeah.
The average child in New Zealand is consuming 17 teaspoons of sugar a day. And so we should work to halve that. We should embrace fat in the context of whole food, fat as it occurs in nature, point 3.
Yeah.
We should restrict device time, and we should promote physical fitness because it's critical for growth development, particularly in adolescence. So those very simple 5 points, there was one in there that was so political. It probably was the main reason you couldn't stay in that role.
Yeah, I probably should have said nothing about fat, but I mean, it just makes sense. And I still think that's scientifically true, and it was then and it is now. And actually, that's so interesting to hear that, Jody, after all that time, that on all of those things, not only we have not improved, we've got worse. And, particularly for our young people, what the main thing that rears its head is their mental health. And over that time, it's got astonishingly worse by magnitudes that I think are astonishing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've now got a 21 and an 18-year-old, and every year they would go into and have sort of mental health sessions, and every year I would say, did they talk about anything below, your spine?
Yeah.
And they would tell me no. There was never a discussion helping them understand the biology that underpins a lot of the mental illness we're seeing.
Yeah,
and that's becoming more and more solid, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. And also, just to, what I see both, at the university, and I've got a 14-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 23-year-old, and with their friends is, a high amount of, poor mental health, especially anxiety. I see a lot of beautiful young people who so-and-so can't come to their exam. They've got anxiety, and or depression. And, this is such a high number of students, and it never used to be a thing 25 years ago. And just to show you how much of a thing it is, New Zealand's data on psychological distress. So this is what gets measured in the National Health Survey, is not mental illness, but just an instrument called the K10, which measures psychological distress. And you can be categorized as having severe psychological distress at the time you filled that out in a nationally representative sample. In 2005, our 16 to 24-year-olds, that was running at 5% at any one time had severe psychological distress.
This is 2005.
2005, and it's not quite representative, because girls generally about twice as high as boys, and it works out to be that average. And that was turning along quite stably until about 2012, 2014, and then as it's done in every other psychological measure in every other English-speaking country, at least in the world, it started to tilt steeply upward, and it's continued like that, such that in 2021. It's moved from 5% in 2005 to 25%. And people know about some of that distress and things. And this one isn't a matter of more diagnosis. This is a reasonably robust reported state of mind that's repeated in large surveys. as a parent and an adult and then an educator and a researcher in this area, I just despair. We're the adults in society. How come we're not stopping this? And I feel quite strongly about that. I know everyone who's in health and medicine and anyone who's a young person as well knows deeply that about this and wants to do something about it, whether you're affected yourself personally, or people who are, or you're in a position to help people who are. Gosh, I mean, it's hard not to want to cry really about it and shout about it, and it's just not even a topic in the news.
No.
And especially for our young women, I mean, boys end up having more suicides, but at every other point below that, even including attempts, self-harm, hospitalizations, major depressive disorder, poor and low mood, girls are twice as bad as boys. And we're not talking about young women's mental health at all. It's not a topic in society.
No. And what we're understanding is some of these people will come from homes that are traumatic, that are stressful, or some of these people may be being bullied. But the greater majority of these kids are living the normal lives that their ancestors would not end up disabled mentally. Can I say that? Mentally disabled, mentally just sort of caught by, trapped.
Well, we end up with a population, and this is not a palliable message, that's fragile.
Yes.
And they're fragile not because of their lack of effort in life or laziness or anything that's on them, but we've created a food environment, a physical activity environment, a social environment where they don't expose themselves to stuff that's hard, and then they can recover from and be a better version of themselves. And that's not telling people to harden up or do better. It's just like, if you're going to have some robust biology to deal with the stresses and strains in life. And a life well lived, remember, has heaps of stress in it. That's what a life well lived has. But negotiating that is the thing, right? And so you need the building blocks for that.
Professor Julia Ruckledge puts it really well when she talks about resilience, and her work, floods, earthquakes, and the mosque shooting. People slept better more quickly. They were able to cope better more quickly. And to me, her work has underpinned a massive amount of evidence in the literature that diet is this great foundation that we are ignoring.
Well, you don't have those essential elements, building blocks to build a better version of yourself, then you can't respond to stress and therefore be resilient. Julie uses the word resilient. I've actually we're good friends and we have a lot of discussion about this. I've been trying to use the word, Nassim Taleb's word for this, which is anti-fragility. Resilience is bouncing back, but actually, part of the thing with stress and trauma is most people don't do badly out of it. Actually, the majority of people do even better. And so, the biological norm under good conditions is anti-fragility, that you tend to become a much stronger version of yourself.
And I guess Taleb's work on complexity is deliciously dovetails with
Yeah. I love all that stuff. Yeah, it sort of takes you back to the old modeling and maths of that, and how you'd even figure this stuff out. It's cool.
So then if we're talking about complexity, you've been doing work on looking at military diets, you've been doing work on dental guidelines, and then your work on prostate cancer. That's mainly exercise-based, I think, and type 2 diabetes, and then of course mental illness. When we layer all these conditions one on top of each other without addressing diet, we talk about multimorbidity because that's very clear in the evidence.
Yeah, it's a good term.
And the cost of multimorbidity is super additive. I think Tony Blake did that paper, or Miller. And so this is how do you explain that in your daily life when you're speaking with students? This risk of getting not just anxiety or type 2 diabetes or poor teeth. How do you talk with your students?
Well, I mean, you're basically talking, the complexity of a human or any, complex biological system is that the same inputs can relate give you slightly different outputs. So, but there is a common cause, and I think poor diet is a good example. But you combine that with low activity and poor sleep and lack of light and these things amongst other things as well. Then for some people that the first thing that goes might be that they have really poor oral health and their teeth all go bad. Other people end up with diabetes first. Other people end up with cancer. Other people end up with poor mental health because there's some complexities within the biology of your system. But that basically all these things are related, and it should be no surprise that this is the case. I mean, it was in the 90s that they came out with the whole syndrome X and metabolic syndrome. Oh, look, these 5 things: visceral adiposity, insulin resistance, high blood pressure, low HDL, and like high triglycerides. Oh, they all converge on, these things all converge on heart disease, on stroke, on depression, on anxiety, on cancer. Oh gosh, Alzheimer's. That's so interesting. And so, really now all my work's just an extension of what we learned in the 90s about metabolic syndrome, and just trying to get, now we know about mitochondria. Now we know about a whole bunch of, other functional hormones, insulin and high insulin, and how that interferes with leptin and blah, blah, blah. So that's all going. And then, you asked about all those projects. They just get, I don't know how I managed to get into such a range of things, but to me, they're quite similar things. The work we do with elite athletes, and in that case, elite soldiers with the army rations, is really only, they're the exact same biological specimen as a normal human off the street. They're just more prepared to do things to themselves that are interesting, and you can find things out. So that's how we get into elite soldiers and elite athletes. And then the special forces soldiers want to do keto diets and fasting and protect themselves from CO2 toxicity when they're diving, or be able to march for 10 days without any food or something like this. So you can learn a tremendous amount. So I sort of go into those because I'm curious, and just end up doing that work. And other ones like diabetes, we've just ended up with, because it's the diet's such an these conditions are so easily reversible with good dietary and behavioural changes, that people keep going, well, you keep going, why are we treating these things with just ineffective medicines when we've got these ridiculously good behavioural treatments? And then other ones like mental health are still the problem of the times. I don't know the solution to the whole solution to mental health, because diet, as you say, I think is critical, but there are other things going on that I don't like, vaping and social media and phone use and screen time, that I don't have the answer to those.
Yeah,
but diet's a part of it.
Technology focused, aren't they? Though they
Yeah.
looking at technology in society, and of course, and so if we go back to type 2 diabetes, in New Zealand, there's 300,000 people diagnosed, and that is forecast to move up to at least 400,000 people in 2014. And the prevalence of diabetes in Maori and Pacifica is 3 times higher than in New Zealand, in other New Zealanders. Now, then you have pre-diabetes as well as that, but then you also have insulin resistance. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, well, that just reminds me of just taking my master's in nutrition class last night, and we're doing exactly this, right? So you can imagine a normal lifespan. You're young, and you just think about how the same meal has a profoundly different effect on you at a different age. You're a young 14-year-old girl or boy, you have a rice meal, and puts your blood sugar up because you're so insulin sensitive. You deal with that, and your blood sugar and insulin are back to normal pretty quick. In many ways, the exact macronutrient composition doesn't make much difference there. But as you get into your 20s and then 30s and then early 40s, well, a whole bunch of things are happening to you: stress, poor sleep, not enough sunlight, blah, blah. All of the things independently cause insulin resistance. And so now you'll go to your doctor and they'll go, well, your blood sugar's normal, Jody or Grant. nothing to worry about. But in fact, the way you're normalizing your blood sugar is through hypersecreting insulin, hyperinsulinemia, which we know is an independent and primary cause of all metabolic disease. And that could continue into your 50s, and you've got a bit fatter, high amounts of insulin, because insulin turns off fat burning. It's a storage hormone. You down-regulate your activity. You feel a bit lethargic. Just your typical development of a few metabolic syndrome factors.
And you've got blood glucose, but you've got higher circulating insulin.
Yeah, you can still normalize your blood glucose, why normal medicine doesn't pick this up. And then eventually you turn up to your doctor and they go, oh, your blood glucose is a bit higher than it should be. It's not what I would, it's not 8 millimoles or something. You haven't really got diabetes. Your HbA1c is not over 50, but it might be 44 or something. That's pre-diabetes. So no, nothing to worry about, Grant. Just maybe lose some weight. You should try a bit harder, but just keep an eye on that. And first of all, it's not pre anything. Just the reality is now, no matter how much insulin you secrete, you cannot normalize your blood glucose. This is not pre. This is like 3 decades in to metabolic dysfunction, and we've missed the entire preceding 30 years of intervening because we don't look for that. And then eventually your blood glucose gets to the magic number of 50 or something, which who knows why that's the magic number. And then they go, oh, okay, actually have diagnosed diabetes now. And then of course you start to enter into the stage of pancreatic failure. So now you've got an underproducing pancreas on top of severe insulin resistance. And then you start treating that by giving yourself extra endogenous insulin. It's madness. It makes no sense to be, and adding extra insulin at that point. The most obvious thing to do is to, eat less carbs so you don't have to put the insulin in the first place.
And Grant, as someone who's been fairly, aware of, let's not eat too much and let's lower your calorie intake.
Yeah.
When you start to understand what the role of insulin is for taking that glucose out and putting it into, as fat into fat cells.
Yeah.
And when you think if you have excess insulin from when you're a child or a teenager that is doing that work, and then you put, insulin treatment on top of that, I wonder.
It's madness.
Are people looking at the fact that this is a side effect of a drug that is driving obesity, but we're not talking about that?
Yeah, and it's 100% true. And it's not just my opinion here. There's randomized trials that were the Accords trial, a big intensive insulin therapy trial, was stopped early due to its futility. The people in the intensive control group got fatter and sicker than the ones who did less. What they should have done is had a third arm where they just did dietary only treatments and see how that worked for them, which would have been, presumably much more effective. So, extra insulin on top of insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, and you figure out the inflammatory storage role of hyperinsulinemia. It makes no sense. And even if you normalize glucose, which you hardly ever do, there's a cost to that. You're better off just not eating the glucose in the first place.
Yeah, and for teenagers dealing with this, we don't learn. Biology. High school biology doesn't learn about this. High school nutrition classes don't teach us about this. Phys ed doesn't teach us about this. Home eco, as a home economics teacher told me, they're just funded for wheat and sugar. And so where could children today learn about the fact that if they were starting to track towards type 2 diabetes, particularly Māori and Pacifica, that this will be an adverse effect of the drugs that they would be recommended?
Yeah, you can't. You can, but you have to know where to look. And so in many ways, this is our own advocacy failure in this space. And my complete failure as the chief, science officer in that Ministry of Education to do that. I had every intention, and the minister who put me in said exactly what you said to me over her desk, and I remember it very clearly. I was like, this will be so cool, we're about to do this. But the reality is I didn't do any of that. to none. And yeah, we've still got, my 14-year-old came home from school literally with a food pyramid, like actual, health at high school food pyramid. And you know, what, 40 years after that came out, 45 years, oh my God.
Absolutely. So in your work separately from your work at AUT, you have started, I think with a certain Dr. Schofield, you're the two founders, a business called Precure. Can you talk about Precure, please?
Oh yeah, so Precure, which is with a K, P-R-E-K-U-R-E, is a bit of a play on the words that prevention is cure. And yeah, I mean, Louise, my wife, who has a PhD in sort of behavior change around public health, is much more risk orientated than I am. I'm, want to be a sort of safe scientist academic. And she's always on about that, not only am I not making any difference, things are getting worse on our watch. And she's 100% right. And so you can do careful randomized trials and show that, you can reverse diabetes or, whatever that stuff, many of which we've done over the years. But it doesn't turn into practice at all. In fact, practice pushes the other way and just keeps carrying on doing what it's doing. So where we've ended up landing is, I hadn't even thought of there was such a profession until Louise was talking about it. And then we started to magnify that. And New Zealand's been a really good early adopter of health coaching. So, a lot of existing health professionals will come and do some of that training with the sort of coaching approach, which is, interestingly, so related to the initial psychology training that you get, shutting up and listening, allowing them to be heard, that they will have some of the solutions in mind. If you tell someone to do something, they almost certainly won't do it, but if they start telling you, they probably will. So the coach approach is such a learnable, fun way to use it. And I've really re-embraced that stuff and used it with my own coaching now. And so then we had the health coaching, and then there's now an association, HCANSA, which accredits both across Australia and New Zealand for health coaches. It's become a professional thing. It's become, the UK's NHS is probably the most advanced with this. So then we've introduced the sort of metabolic health coach and the mental health coaching as more advanced pathways with Precure. And yeah, we're really proud. We've trained I think about 1,500 health professionals in the whole approach, but in New Zealand and Australia now, and fully accredited through the full courses, about 500 health coaches, aiming for many thousands. But yeah, that's been such a rewarding journey. And other people enter that profession from other career changes. They were in corporate life and wanted to do something with some more meaning, and so they'd upskill in that as well. So we've come from various different places, or had their own health journey and seen the way forward.
And when I think about health coaches and the work that is involved in changing diets profoundly and changing your attitude to life and food, it feels that it's a similar trajectory to like addiction counseling, sort of creating the skills to deal with those impulses, learning the skills to make food easy and not hard. Are there similarities there?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and and to be fair, frankly, there's addiction involved as well in the food. So there's one thing.
Yeah.
And we're quite a fan of Jen Unwin's work around food addictions and whatnot from the UK. I want to do more of that research myself. So there are actual addictive behaviors involved, but yeah, you're right. I mean, you're never going to tell an alcoholic that they're an alcoholic and they just need to stop it. It's just a futile approach. They need to say, yeah, this is where I'm at. This is what I want to talk about. I want my life to be better. They've got to reach, dissonance and resonance around their behaviors and say, yeah, I really want to pursue this. I see this as a solution. What's worked for you before? I've done this. How would you like to move forward? Blah, blah, blah. What would you like my role to be? About accountability or helping provide resources. And stuff is health coaching, and that's the same process in addictions, really.
Yeah, and I presume that there's tipping points, someone being diagnosed with a disease or someone knowing that they can't go on anymore, and
Yeah.
the tipping points will be similar.
Yeah, 100%. And like in many ways, sometimes I see type 2 diabetics and they said they'll come back 10 years later and go, type 2 diabetes saved my life, and you're like, wow, that's an interesting way of framing that. But
Absolutely.
they put it into remission, but that actual point made a big difference.
But the thing that Dr. Emma Sanford talked about when she's looking at eye care, eye health, and ophthalmology, when people come to her and they start dealing with their eye health, all of a sudden their other health parameters improve because they're seeking to heal one thing. So do you find that the health coaches find that?
Oh yeah. In fact, I was talking to someone last night about exactly this, where they'd been doing some health coaching work with a woman who had had coincidentally developed type 2 diabetes, but also lost her hearing. And they were like, then no one knew what had happened, and they resolved her diet, got her diabetes under control, and her hearing came back. It's an astonishing thing. And there is stuff with that, definitely with diet, with tinnitus and stuff. And I had to actually give a lecture a couple of years ago to the ophthalmologist down in Queenstown. Unfortunately, I got the flu on the very moment I was supposed to do this talk, so it was a hideous talk. But the background reading, and on that, I hadn't quite realised how important vascular and metabolic health was in across the whole range of those eye things, from retinopathy to glaucoma and all these things. So that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if Precure, are people doing this that are also working for charities and social organizations where they might not be turning around and earning however much an hour, but they've more done the health coaching to look after local communities?
So, I mean, the most interesting example of that is we have a couple of really good partners. One's the Pacifica Medical Association, which is a Pacific health provider group, and it's really mainly their community health team and their social work team that would do this health coaching work. And they don't necessarily even come from a health background, but they're so well connected in their community. They're in people's houses, they're working with them, that coach approach has been effective. We've got a similar one down in Wairoa with Kahui, and we've got another similar one up north with Mahitahi Hauora Health as well. And those are really interesting groups. So that I mean, these are trusts, I suppose, that falls into that category. But I think there's such a everyone wants to train in cultural sensitivity. Well, in my words, I think you want to train in technical proficiency and use people who are local, who have already got cultural, by definition, have got everything connected and cultural about them. That's almost impossible to learn, the cultural stuff. And the technical stuff is what you can learn, and ultimately the two together make such a big difference.
Yes, and in another interview that I listened to, you were talking, and you said something that I often say is, the more we understand about science and the impact of food and nutrition, the more we come back to the diets that our ancestors had. So if you're working with Maori, Pacifica, Indian communities, you can come back to what the ancestors consumed and then come from a technical approach, and it makes absolute sense.
Makes perfect sense.
So you don't need to be patronizing.
No. I'm a real fan of an ancestral approach, frankly. I just think all of science makes sense in an evolutionary biology perspective, and only in that context it doesn't make any sense. And I think diet, particularly, my God, I mean, you can imagine living in the way our hunter-gatherers did. It's impossible not to be in good shape. And we think about the sort of nasty, brutish, short lives, and running around, hobbling around in caves. These were big, robust specimens of people with even bigger brains than we've got. They had other problems of violence and infection and these sorts of things, and we don't want to go back and just sleep around in caves. But it wasn't all bad.
Absolutely. Now, in our last 5 minutes, how could we put the Precure into the New Zealand health system? How could such a project or such work be integrated? Have you done any work on that? Have you talked to people about that? What can you
Yeah,
help me with here?
I mean, there's an extraordinary problem with medical inflation, right? So yeah, it's another $1 billion a year just to keep doing what you're doing, but we add on other extra costs and things go up, and we just end up with this nearly $30 billion, our biggest single government expense, our biggest taxpayer expense that goes to treating just sickness. Could we take there's so much talk about preventative medicine, there's so much talk about lifestyle medicine, there's so much talk about helping people live their best lives and this sort of thing. You'd actually have to, even if you did something not even that radical, like took 10% of the health budget, $3 billion, and said, we're going to allocate this to prevention and healthy living and reorientating the way people live so they have meaningful, engaged, healthy lives. Then, and that's not even what you would get the best return on. You could spend way more than that, but that would be an extraordinary change. The question is, though, in order to do that, you'd either have to find new money or you have to stop doing something else. And this is where the message gets really unpalatable for people. The reality is we spend a third of our healthcare in the last 6 months of people's lives for procedures that most people wouldn't have consented to, for procedures that make little or no difference to the quality and the quantity of their life, and in many cases make it worse. So you'd want to take that money from there. That's not I'm not sure that's an adult conversation that we're ready to have, because we don't seem to be able to have the maturity to do that. But what will we do with that $3 billion? Well, I think there's first of all, the idea of just health promotion in general. New Zealand, when I first started, was the most active country in the world, and we spent many millions on campaigns around being active, and they do have some effect. And so all of our nutrition and exercise and sleep, health promotion, and what it takes to have a healthy life is either stuck in old curriculum from the 80s in schools or is non-existent in a public face. So you need to spend $1 billion a year on that, which would be a massive change, and you can actually get behavior change at that level. Then you would upskill this health coach workforce, and it doesn't have to be just people in health. That the literacy and what it takes to have a good life is available to everyone. It shouldn't be restricted to doctors or psychologists or other people carrying particular cards. That's learnable by us all. And then third of all, and this applies particularly to mental health, we need to spend some money in the sort of reversing the crisis part. We can reverse type 2 diabetes, and probably the most, and we should spend money on that. And the most obvious one, I think, is the most profoundly disturbing thing in the whole health system is a mental health crisis. And so I've had this, I've had you ring, we have a crisis helpline, you ring them, and I've had this with a young woman that was a friend of ours, and I said, she's suicidal. They said, oh, is she killing herself right now? It's like, oh, no, she's threatening to. And they're like, oh, okay, have you asked her how she's feeling? I had thought of that. And they said, look, if it gets any work, just ring the police. I mean, the humanity of that is unbelievable, that you would ring the police on your daughter, your niece, your granddaughter, your next door neighbor, your mother, and that sort of thing. And we have no capacity to look after people in crisis and help them in this country, and that's just inhumane. So that's how I would spend $3 billion a year if I had the chance, but I don't know if we're ready for the conversation around where that's coming from.
Well, I probably would have that conversation as someone who has been researching the absence of funding for the sciences for academia, for health and agriculture. I have been looking closely at the appropriations process and how that works. And we actually can appropriate money through the parliamentary process to achieve this. It can be done. And it can be done because we don't have to take off an offshore loan to actually appropriate our own government money to pay our people to care for our people. And it's not, you know, it's actually a political death wish. If anyone talks about this, they're politically cancelled, but that's okay because, you know, I'm not, you know, RNZ will take my prompts for an interview, so it's okay. I gave up. So we can actually fund this. It's all there, but it's just that culture is of we have to take from the poor and, you know, give to the government, and we can't do it, and we actually can. Thank you very much, Grant, and I'm really pleased that you're in the place you're in, and you might be saying that you don't feel like you're achieving much, but to me it feels like you're achieving a heck of a lot. You really are.
Oh, yeah, but you ultimately judge by what happens on your watch, and we're not getting that much better. To be honest, Jody, we've made backward progress.
But we also know that, and you know, we can step into it. We should be finishing up, but informed consent. So if young people in New Zealand today knew that if they could take multi-nutrients and if they could change their diet, that they would alleviate many of their health conditions, would, as informed consent instead of SSRIs, and how would they respond to that as a choice? And so we don't actually have that choice today in New Zealand.
No, you're right. And yeah, they're no-brainers, these choices, and even to be offered, you know, behavioral support to, you know, to get moving again, you know, or just to eat better, and, you know, sleep techniques and stuff. We just don't have any of that, and the go-to SSRI is despicable. I mean, you and I both know that. Well, I think we agree on that.
Yes, and so Georgia Ede, you know, Harvard-trained psychiatrist who's just released the book, you know, Change Your Diet, Change Your Life. She was a classic clinical psychiatrist for her first 10 years, but for her last 15 years, she calls herself a nutritional psychiatrist, and she wouldn't go back. And as she observes so often in the work she does, so many of these kids that she's seeing and these people have digestive problems. They have, you know, multimorbidity, comorbid health conditions, and there is so much excitement where we can go to start looking in that world. And I think the work you're doing with Precure is really creating that model to take that into the academic system and to help people understand, and into families, into organizations. I think you're in a really great space, and I'm really grateful. Anything else you'd like to say to finish off?
No, I just think that last little story you're telling about, you know, that choice for young people. Yeah, when you see an individual story of a young person that's turned their bipolar or their psychosis or their, you know, Crohn's disease or their, you know, various things, you know, around completely, you know, completely disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore. You know, every one of those, even by itself, is a huge celebration. But behind that are 10 that have never got to the solution and lived a whole life with an easily reversible condition. And that's the tragedy of not investing in this, actually, are those, each one of those 10 people.
Absolutely. And this all can be done, Grant. So, hey, shall we continue working on this?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.